Snow clung to the roofs of the small town of Ashfield in the winter of 1849, quieting the streets with a heavy hush that made every footstep echo like an intrusion. The orphanage stood at the edge of the woods, a slate-colored building with narrow windows, and a reputation that locals spoke of only in careful tones. The children inside were many, too many for the strained staff, and their laughter rarely carried beyond the gates. Yet, on certain days, something else did. The sound of dozens of pencils scratching against paper in eerie unison. The drawings were first noticed by Miss Hanrahan, a teacher whose own nerves were brittle from years of discipline and silence. She discovered them scattered across the long tables of the study hall, sketches etched in a child's uncertain hand, yet disturbingly precise. Graves, crosses, long pits filled with faceless forms. Every child had drawn them, from the youngest who could barely hold chalk to the eldest on the cusp of leaving. She gathered the pages with trembling fingers, but she did not throw them away. Something about them felt more like records than imagination. Dr. Elijah Wren, the town's physician, would later confess that this detail unsettled him most. He had seen children draw monsters or mimic soldiers' uniforms reflecting the world they caught in fragments. But these sketches were too aligned, too consistent. It was as if, he wrote in his notes, they were describing the same memory without having lived it. His handwriting trailed darker on the word memory, as though he doubted even the language he used. The following Sunday, the minister visited the orphanage to hold prayers. Between hymns, he asked the children what they had been working on. Their answers chilled the adults. "We drew the holes," one boy said plainly. Another corrected, "No, not holes. They are for sleeping, for the quiet people." The minister pressed them, but their responses remained simple, united, and void of fear, as if what they described was not morbid at all, but a fact of life so self-evident it required no shame. Rumors traveled quickly in Ashfield. Shopkeepers whispered that the children must have overheard old burial tales from the cholera epidemic that had swept the region years before. But the orphanage director insisted none of them had been exposed to such history. Some of the children had only arrived that autumn, yet their drawings matched perfectly with those who had been there for years. The possibility that they were sharing a secret, a collective trick, began to dissolve under the weight of the evidence. Dr. Wren's unease grew sharper when he inspected one of the drawings more closely. It depicted a large oak tree at the edge of a clearing, its branches bent in a familiar way. He recognized it at once. The tree stood just beyond the town's western ridge. Beneath its roots, the children had scrawled the outline of a trench, filled with indistinct figures lying side by side. He tried to dismiss it as chance, but his mind betrayed him with questions. How could they all know the same tree, the same slope of ground? That night, he could not sleep. His journal records that he dreamt of children walking hand in hand through snow, their pale faces lit not by lanterns but by something below the earth itself. He woke with the taste of soil in his mouth, though he could not explain why. The following morning, Miss Hanrahan arrived at his door, pale and trembling. She clutched another stack of sketches. "They've drawn more," she whispered. "And this time, Doctor, this time they've drawn names." The words lingered in Dr. Wren's study like the cold air that seeped through the cracks in the windows. He motioned Miss Hanrahan to sit, but she remained standing as if her legs feared the weight of stillness. She unwrapped the stack of papers as one might unbind evidence from a courtroom and laid them out across his desk. Each page bore the familiar shallow pits, the faceless figures, but now, beneath the crude sketches, scrawled in uneven letters, were names. The doctor leaned close. He expected nonsense syllables, the broken inventions of children, but his chest tightened when he recognized some of them. Elias Morton, Mary Ann Prentice, John Packer. These were not names plucked from fantasy. They belonged to townsfolk who had passed in recent years, their bodies lowered into the ground in ordinary graves, marked and remembered. But on these papers, the names were paired with drawings of trenches, not single plots. Miss Hanrahan's voice cracked as she explained that when she asked the children who told them the names, their answer was unanimous. They came to us in the dark. Not once, not in fragments. Every child had said it. Dr. Wren felt a shiver coil around his spine. In his profession, he had seen fevers burn reason from young minds, yet he could not explain such uniformity of vision across dozens of children. The following day, he visited the orphanage again, compelled by something he could not name. The children were gathered in the main hall, silent, their papers spread before them like offerings. When he approached one boy, small and sickly, the child looked up with eyes too calm for his age. "They're not finished," the boy whispered. "There are more names to come." It was then that Dr. Wren realized what unsettled him most. The children did not seem distressed. They were not frightened of their drawings, nor of the voices they claimed had visited them. Rather, they behaved as though they were participating in a task expected of them, something given, not chosen. I wonder for a moment if you listening now can feel what he must have felt in that room. Perhaps you are alone in a dim chamber of your own, the hum of night pressing close against your walls. If this voice reaches you and keeps you company through the dark, you might leave a comment or even subscribe, simply to let me know you are still out there, breathing in the quiet with me. That same evening, Wren confided his observations to the minister, but the minister dismissed it as shared fantasy, a contagion of imagination. Children dream in echoes, he insisted, yet the physician was not convinced. Dreams do not match names with the dead so precisely. Unable to contain his dread, Dr. Wren returned to the western ridge where the oak tree grew. The snow was thick, the ground hard beneath it. He stood beneath the bent branches, staring at the earth as though it might stir. His lantern light revealed nothing unusual, only the soft shadows of winter. Still, he could not shake the sensation that beneath the soil lay more than roots. The following morning, as he prepared to revisit the orphanage, word reached him that one of the younger boys, Samuel, had been found standing outside in the snow before dawn, barefoot, staring at the churchyard. He did not speak when brought inside. He only held a stick in his hand, and with it he had drawn in the frost. Another trench, another row of faceless figures, and beneath them, 3 more names, names of the living. Dr. Wren could not bring himself to speak the words aloud, even as they echoed in his mind like a bell struck in a hollow chamber. The boy Samuel had scratched them into frost with a steady hand, letters too exact for his tender age. And what chilled Wren most was that he knew those names. They belonged not to the dead, but to men and women who still walked Ashfield streets, a shopkeeper, a midwife, and the town constable. When the constable himself arrived at the orphanage to question the boy, he dismissed the drawings with a gruff laugh. "Children conjure nonsense," he declared, brushing snow from his coat. Yet as he turned the paper over in his hands, Wren caught a flicker in his eyes, a momentary unease that betrayed the bravado. The child had not only written his name, but placed it beneath a sketch of a trench already crowded with shadowy forms. The midwife, upon hearing of it, grew pale. She remembered whispers of an older burial ground near the ridge, a place spoken of only by the oldest families where victims of fever had been lowered without ceremony. "Mass graves," she murmured, and more than one. Her words were quickly silenced by the minister, who warned against stirring panic with tales half remembered. Yet silence did little to ease the air in town. At the orphanage, the children continued their work. More drawings appeared, some showing the same oak tree, others depicting unfamiliar clearings. Always there were trenches, always faceless figures, and sometimes the names were not yet of the dead. Wren's journal grew thick with notes, sketches, and questions he could not resolve. He began to suspect that what the children created was not invention but revelation. Yet to suggest such a thing aloud risked his reputation and his standing as a man of science. He turned instead to observation, watching the children as they worked. Their faces bore no fear, only the calm diligence of craftsmen fulfilling a task handed down. One evening, as lanterns dimmed in the orphanage halls, he caught sight of Samuel again. The boy stood at a window gazing out toward the ridge. When asked what he saw, the child whispered, "They are calling." His voice was not trembling, not uncertain. It was filled with the clarity of a messenger. The next morning, townsfolk awoke to find the constable's body. He had died suddenly in his sleep, no mark upon him. His name, written days earlier in frost, now belonged among the departed. The news spread quickly, turning skepticism into murmurs of dread. Some whispered of curses, others of witchcraft, though none dared voice it openly in a town where such words carried the weight of old punishments. Dr. Wren recorded the moment in his journal with a shaking hand. The children's drawings do not foretell, they assign. To be named is to be chosen. He stopped writing after that line, as if fearful that to record too much would bind him to the same fate. Yet silence could not protect him. That night, when Miss Hanrahan returned with another stack of papers, she placed one sheet on his desk with trembling hands. "You should see this for yourself," she said. On the paper was the familiar oak tree, the trench beneath it, and a row of names. At the bottom, written in a child's uncertain scrawl, was his own. Dr. Wren stared at the page, his pulse beating in his throat, each throb echoing with the weight of a sentence passed. His name, his own name, written by a hand too small, too unknowing, and yet carrying an authority that felt older than the children themselves. He pressed his palm against the paper as if by touch alone he could deny its truth, but the letters did not vanish. Miss Hanrahan watched him carefully, her lips pale and trembling. "Doctor," she whispered, "what does it mean?" "Surely it cannot—" She stopped short, as though speaking the thought aloud would make it more real. Wren forced composure into his voice. "It is nothing but mimicry. They have seen me here, they have heard my name, and it bleeds into their drawings." Yet even as he spoke, he did not believe his own words. The children had named the constable before his sudden passing, and before him, others. Each time, the page had been an omen no one wished to acknowledge, until it was too late. That night, he sat alone in his study, the drawing before him, candlelight flickering across the black strokes of charcoal. He told himself he was a man of science, that the world obeyed rules and reasons. But when the flame bent toward the page as if pulled, and the letters of his name seemed darker than the rest, he felt his reason falter. He could not shake the thought. The act of being written was the act of being claimed. By morning, he resolved to confront the children, directly. He returned to the orphanage, his steps heavy across the snow. The halls smelled faintly of wax and damp wool, the echoes of tiny shoes padding on worn floorboards. When he entered the study hall, the children looked up in unison, their gazes unnervingly calm. "Who wrote my name?" he asked, his voice stern. A silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Then Samuel, the boy who had first drawn the frost letters, stepped forward. "We did not write it," he said evenly. "They told us." "Who told you?" Wren demanded. The boy's small hand lifted, pointing toward the window where the skeletal oak of the western ridge stood outlined against the gray sky. "They, under the tree." His voice was not frightened, only resolute. Wren's breath caught. He looked to Miss Hanrahan, who had accompanied him. Her face was white, her eyes locked on the boy as though he were uttering scripture. She whispered to Wren, "They believe it." Every word. The doctor tried to reason with himself. Children reflect stories, children fabricate, yet he felt the gnawing certainty that something deliberate, something cold and calculating was at work here. Not childish fancy, but a pattern. Each name, each drawing leading toward inevitability. That night, unable to resist, he returned alone to the oak ridge. Snow fell heavier, cloaking the land, muffling sound. Lantern in hand, he traced the ground where the roots spread wide. At first, only silence answered, but then, faintly beneath his boots, he felt it, the hollow give of soil, disturbed ground not as firm as winter earth should be. He dropped to his knees, brushed snow aside, and pressed his palm flat against the earth. For a moment, it was only cold dirt, but then, unmistakably, the faintest vibration pulsed through the soil, like a breath exhaled from below. And when he lifted his lantern, he saw it. Fresh scratches carved into the bark of the oak, letters gouged deep by no child's hand. His name, again, etched into the tree itself. Dr. Wren staggered back from the oak as if the bark itself had spoken. The grooves were fresh, raw wood glinting in the lantern light. His name, repeated once more, no longer confined to paper or frost. He touched the letters with his fingertips, the edges sharp, still shedding small curls of wood. No child's hand had done this. The cuts were too deliberate, too deep. Something had marked him. The night pressed in around him, heavy and suffocating. He lifted the lantern higher, scanning the snow. No footprints circled the tree, no tracks led to or away. The silence was whole, unbroken, except for the faint hiss of wind through the branches. He swallowed, forcing breath back into his lungs, and retreated step by step until the ridge fell away behind him. By dawn, he was seated in the orphanage's study hall once again, staring across the rows of children as they bent dutifully over their papers. More drawings. Always more. Some now bore not only trenches and names, but crude circles of faces above the ground, as if crowds were watching the burial from the edges. Their hollow eyes seemed fixed on Wren himself. He whispered to Miss Hanrahan, "Do they ever stop?" "Not once," she replied, her voice drained. "Each day they rise. Each night they rest, and in between, this. It is their only play, their only work." The physician pressed his hands together, trying to order thought. He had studied patterns of illness, outbreaks that moved like shadows through populations. But this was no fever. This was something else, a contagion of knowledge. Each child was a vessel, carrying pieces of an unseen whole, and he could not find the root. That evening he sought counsel from the minister once more. The man bristled when Wren described the carvings on the oak. "Nonsense," the minister barked, though his eyes darted as if recalling tales he wished forgotten. "We will not have the town descend into superstition." "But what if superstition is the only map we have?" Wren countered. His voice carried a desperation that startled even him. "These are not imaginings. They are instructions." The minister turned away, refusing to hear more. Yet Wren noted how the man's hand trembled as it clutched his Bible, knuckles pale against the leather. The following night, unable to fight his compulsion, Wren returned to the ridge. The air was bitter, clouds veiling the moon. His lantern swept over the snow and his stomach lurched. Around the oak were new carvings, but not on the bark, on the earth itself. Lines scored deep into frozen soil, forming the outlines of a trench. It stretched longer than any child's imagination could measure, waiting like an open mouth. His knees weakened. He knew then that the children's drawings were not inventions at all, but rehearsals, plans, replicated over and over until they no longer belonged to the children's minds, but to something beyond them. He stumbled back down the slope, half running, lantern swaying wildly in his grip. But when he reached the orphanage gates, he froze. In the snow before the doors, freshly drawn with small sticks, was another trench. And inside it, beside faceless figures, his name again, this time joined by Miss Hanrahan's. Dr. Wren felt his breath seize as if the cold night itself had entered his lungs. He bent closer to the snow, his lantern throwing long shadows across the rough stick marks. There was no mistaking it, his name and hers scrawled side by side, as though their fates had been tethered by a hand unseen. His mind raced with possibilities. Could the children have slipped outside in the night to carve these lines? Yet the snow was unbroken, smooth and untouched, but for the drawing itself. The next morning he called for Miss Hanrahan in private. She paled at the sight of the sketch he had copied into his journal, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the letters of her own name. "Why mine?" she whispered. "I have never questioned them, never doubted their visions." "That is precisely why," Wren replied, though he was uncertain whether the words were meant for her or for himself. "They do not choose at random. They place those who observe, who draw near." His eyes darkened. "They are watching us more than we watch them." That day the children were quieter than usual, their pencils moving without sound, their faces serene. Wren paced behind them, resisting the urge to snatch the pages away. He forced himself to study instead. The drawings were shifting, no longer merely trenches and trees. Now there were structures, crude outlines of the orphanage itself, its hallways and rooms, each one marked with figures in black. Some were lying down, some standing, some with names written neatly beneath. His own appeared more than once. So did hers. Later, as the sky dimmed and snow began to fall again, Wren lingered at the edge of the room, watching. The children, as if sensing his gaze, turned their heads slowly toward him. Dozens of pairs of eyes, clear and glassy, fixed on him in silence. The moment stretched, unbearable, until one child, a girl with tangled hair, spoke in a voice barely above breath. "Do you know where you will lie, Doctor?" The question pierced him like ice. He tried to steady himself, managing a hoarse reply. "Where I choose." The girl's lips curled into something too close to a smile. "No one chooses." Wren staggered out into the corridor, his mind unraveling. He could not confront them as children any longer. They were messengers, conduits, something far colder than innocence. The more he studied, the more he realized the patterns were too deliberate, as if guided by a hand behind their small fingers. That night, alone in his study, he laid out all the drawings he had gathered. His desk became a graveyard of paper. Slowly he aligned them, edge to edge, as though they were pieces of one larger design. The more he fit them together, the clearer the picture became. Not random graves, not scattered trenches, but a map. A sequence of sites spreading outward from the ridge, swallowing fields, roads, and finally, the town itself. His pulse quickened as realization struck. The children were not predicting deaths. They were charting them, step by step, grave by grave, and the map was not finished. At the center of the unfinished expanse, crudely outlined, was the orphanage itself. And within its walls, marked in dark strokes, were his quarters and Miss Hanrahan's room, names already inscribed. Dr. Wren stared at the assembled drawings, the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. Each page, once scattered nonsense, had now become a meticulous chart. He could not deny the precision of the lines, the way the children's hands had mapped a plan no child could imagine on their own. The orphanage sat at the heart of it, encircled by graves like a fortress of the dead. And his own quarters, marked clearly, left no space for doubt. The next morning he brought Miss Hanrahan into his study. She looked over the spread of papers with horror tightening her face. "It's as if..." She hesitated, her voice barely audible. "As if they're not just seeing, they're building it." Her eyes flicked to his. step by step, as though something instructs them. Wren nodded grimly. Something cold, deliberate, not a sickness of mind, but a design unfolding through them. Their unease deepened when one of the older boys, Peter, approached them later that day. His manner was calm, his hands folded as though in prayer. "It is almost ready," he said, looking straight at Wren. "When it is finished, all will lie together." There was no malice in his voice, only certainty. The doctor, unsettled but unable to resist, pressed him. "What will be finished?" The boy's gaze drifted to the window, to the western ridge beyond. "The place where they wait." Then he walked away without another word. That evening, driven by equal parts fear and curiosity, Wren ventured into the orphanage's cellar, a place long neglected. The stone steps groaned beneath his boots, and the air was damp with earth. He lit a lantern and swept its glow across the walls. There, carved into the stone in rough, uneven lines, were the same shapes the children drew. Trenches, circles of faceless forms, the oak tree, and beneath them, scratched deeper, were sequences of numbers. Dates, perhaps, or something darker. At the far end of the cellar, he found what chilled him most, a crude diagram of the orphanage itself etched directly into the wall, nearly identical to the one he had pieced together upstairs. His room, Miss Hanrahan's room, the study hall, all marked. The scratches looked old, predating the children now living above. Whoever had carved them had done so years before, maybe decades. He felt the ground beneath him shudder faintly, as though something deep below the stone was stirring. He staggered back, lantern shaking in his grip. The thought formed unbidden in his mind. The children were not inventing, they were continuing. When he returned upstairs, Miss Hanrahan was waiting, her eyes wide. "They know you've been below," she whispered. "How could they?" "They asked me," she said, voice cracking. "They wanted to know if you had seen the wall. They said it was time." Before Wren could reply, a sound rose from the study hall, the low, unified murmur of many voices. He rushed to the doorway and saw them, dozens of children standing in perfect rows, their papers scattered on the floor. They were chanting something low, rhythmic, in words too fractured to catch. Their eyes were open, unblinking, fixed on the dark windows as though awaiting a signal only they could perceive. And then, as if answering, a tremor passed through the floorboards beneath their feet. The walls groaned, lanterns quivered, and the air thickened with dust. Dr. Wren coughed against the sudden weight in the room, his lantern beam swaying through the haze. The children did not flinch. Their chant grew steadier, their voices weaving into one another like the strands of a single rope. Miss Hanrahan clutched his arm, whispering frantic prayers under her breath. The doctor could not pray, he could only watch. The tremor passed as swiftly as it had come, leaving silence behind it. But the silence was worse than the noise. It felt inhabited, like a pause waiting for its next command. Then, without cue, the children bent together, picking up their pencils and resuming their drawings as if nothing had occurred. That night, Wren wrote furiously in his journal. "They are conduits, not creators. They record what is given to them. The earth itself may be dictating their hands. If that is true, then resistance may be futile, but understanding is the only weapon I have left." His hand shook so violently that ink spattered across the page. The following day, he sought answers beyond the orphanage. He carried a copy of the children's map to the town magistrate, urging him to see the danger. But the man laughed him off. "You are a physician, not a prophet," he scoffed. "If children wish to scribble, let them. Their scrawls do not concern the law." Wren pressed further, but the magistrate's expression hardened. "Do not bring me superstition dressed in ink, doctor. The town cannot afford panic." Even the minister, once shaken, now refused to hear. When Wren showed him the diagrams, the man slammed his Bible shut. "These are the works of the devil, and I will not indulge them," he thundered. Yet his eyes betrayed him, haunted, uncertain. He feared, but he would not act. It was then Ren understood the true horror. He was alone. Whatever force moved through the children, the town would not acknowledge it until too late. When he returned to the orphanage, Samuel was waiting at the gates. The boy's face was pale but calm, his gaze steady. "They don't believe you," he said simply. Ren froze. "How do you know what I've done?" The boy tilted his head. "They tell us everything. They said you would run to the men of law and faith and that they would turn you away." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They said you are almost ready to understand." That night, Ren found it impossible to rest. He dreamed of the oak again, its roots sinking deeper than any tree should reach, curling around bones that shifted in the dark. He woke to the sound of scratching, faint, steady against the wood of his chamber wall. With trembling hands, he lit his lantern. There, etched freshly into the paneling beside his bed, was another drawing. A trench, deeper and longer than before. Inside it lay countless, faceless bodies, but this time, one figure was drawn standing apart, lantern in hand, unmistakable in its posture. Above it, scrawled in rough letters, was a single word: witness. The word burned itself into Dr. Ren's thoughts, louder than the silence that followed. He reached out, fingers trembling over the grooves in the wood. They were fresh, damp with the scent of shavings. No child had been near his quarters. He had locked his door, and yet the marking was there, as if the wall itself had yielded to a hand unseen. Morning brought no comfort. Miss Hanrahan noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders bent beneath an invisible burden. When he showed her the carving, she went rigid. "Why witness?" she whispered. "I do not know," Ren admitted. "Perhaps because I will not be spared. Perhaps because I must see it through." His voice cracked on the last word. That day, the children's behavior shifted. They no longer filled pages with pits and names alone. Instead, their drawings grew narrower, more specific. They began sketching people around them, not merely the townsfolk, but those closest to Ren. Miss Hanrahan's likeness appeared, her figure outlined and marked with a trench. Then others, villagers who had doubted, neighbors who had dismissed the warnings. Even the minister's stern face took shape on their pages, placed beneath the heavy crosshatch of earth. When Ren tried to collect the drawings, the children resisted, not with tantrums, but with an unnerving calm. "They are not yours to keep," one girl said. "They belong to the ground." Fear turned to urgency when Samuel approached him again, this time with a sheet folded carefully in his hands. He gave it to Ren without a word and turned away. The doctor unfolded it slowly, and his chest tightened. Upon the page was his own home, drawn in uncanny detail, every shutter and brick in its place. Inside, faintly sketched in one corner, was the figure of his sister and her 2 young daughters who lived with him. Their names were written clearly beneath, each letter deliberate. His blood ran cold. They were not in the orphanage. They were not part of this place. And yet, the children had claimed them. That evening, Ren rushed through the snow to his house. He found his sister alive, her daughters asleep by the fire, unaware of the doom inked into charcoal. He wanted to warn her, to drag them all away. But how could he? To speak the truth would brand him mad. To stay silent felt like betrayal. He kissed their foreheads with a desperation he could not voice and left before dawn. Back at the orphanage, the children greeted him with quiet nods, as if they had expected his absence. Samuel's calm voice broke the silence. "It does not matter where they are. The ground finds everyone." The words sank into Ren like a blade. It was no longer the orphanage alone that was threatened. The design was widening, stretching its reach, beyond walls and borders. No family, no hearth, no church would remain untouched. And then Miss Hanrahan came to him, pale, clutching yet another drawing. Her hand shook as she held it out. "Doctor," she whispered, "they've begun to draw you with us. You and me, standing together." He took the paper. There it was, the two of them, side by side, lanterns in hand, staring into a trench far larger than any before. And around the trench were rows of faceless watchers, endless in number, their eyes fixed not on the graves, but on him. Dr. Wren could not tear his gaze from the drawing. Those faceless watchers seemed alive even on paper, their absence of features somehow sharper than any expression. They surrounded the trench like a congregation, and every line of their attention converged upon his solitary figure. He felt a sickness churn in his stomach. The children were no longer just recording what was buried. They were recording him, his role, his place in the unfolding order. Miss Hanrahan's hands gripped his sleeve. "Do you see it, Doctor? They've chosen you. Whatever this is, you are not merely a name among others. You are central." Her words were true, and yet they deepened his dread. He spent hours in his study, examining the collection of drawings as though they were case files, evidence in a trial. Again and again he found the same patterns, the trenches growing wider, the watchers multiplying, and always his figure placed at the center, sometimes standing, sometimes kneeling, sometimes holding a lantern over open ground. The children's details were too consistent, too deliberate to dismiss. He began to think of it as a progression, as though the children had been following steps. At first, the drawings were simple, holes, faceless forms, random names. Then came the oak, the trenches with the townsfolk, the maps. Now their hands revealed the stage itself, with him as witness or participant. The escalation was undeniable, a methodical order unfolding with each new page. Unable to bear it, Wren tried an experiment. He asked one of the older boys to sit with him, providing fresh paper and pencil. "Draw something of your own," he said gently. "Not the graves, a house, perhaps, a tree, anything you like." The boy looked at him with eyes that felt older than they should be. "I cannot," he said. "Why not?" "Because they will not let me." Wren's throat tightened. "Who are they?" The boy lowered his gaze, voice flat. "The ones who live below." That night, Wren returned once more to the ridge, lantern swaying in his hand. The oak loomed, its bark scarred with marks both old and new. The snow at its roots seemed disturbed, though no footprints lay near. He knelt, pressing his ear to the frozen ground. At first, only silence answered, then faintly he heard it, a slow, steady rhythm, like hands moving soil, like breaths drawn through earth. He stumbled back, lantern trembling in his grip. His mind wrestled between reason and terror. Was it echo, imagination, the pulse of his own body mirrored in the ground? Or was it something real, something rising? When he returned to the orphanage, Miss Hanrahan was waiting. She held a new page, her face ghost pale. "They drew this while you were gone," she whispered. He took it, dread seizing him before his eyes even fell upon the charcoal. And there it was, himself, kneeling beneath the oak, lantern in hand. Behind him a trench stretched open, and within it lay not strangers but people he knew. His sister, her daughters, Miss Hanrahan herself. And above them all, the faceless watchers stood in rows, closer now, leaning as if eager to see. Dr. Wren felt their imagined gaze burrow into him as though the page itself breathed. The watchers were no longer distant silhouettes. They were pressing forward, leaning with intent, studying him as though he alone mattered in the unfolding ritual. His pulse hammered in his throat. Miss Hanrahan's whisper broke the silence. "Doctor, they are coming closer to you, each page closer." He had no answer. The drawings had grown in sequence, as though charting not merely graves but a narrative he was powerless to resist. And now his role had shifted from observer to subject. He was not only a witness, he was being drawn into their stage. That evening he locked his study door, yet found no comfort in the barrier. The scratching on the wood returned, faint but constant, as though tiny hands were tracing lines just beyond his reach. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound lived inside him now. He thought of the word etched into his wall, witness, and wondered if this was the cruelest role of all, to watch what no one else could see, and to know escape was impossible. The following day, his dread turned tangible. The children no longer merely glanced at him, they watched him openly, without blinking. When he crossed the hall, dozens of heads turned in unison. When he spoke to Miss Hanrahan, they leaned slightly forward, listening, without expression. It was not the gaze of children, but of an audience. Samuel approached again, as though chosen by something beyond himself. His voice was steady, his eyes fixed. "They are ready for you, Doctor." Wren swallowed hard. "Ready? For what?" "To join the line," Samuel said simply. "No one may watch forever. All must enter." Panic surged in him, but he forced himself to remain composed. "And what happens when I enter?" Samuel tilted his head, considering, as if translating something too vast for words. "The ground takes what belongs, and you belong." That night, Wren packed his journals, determined to flee Ashfield. He would take the drawings, his notes, and leave the town behind. Yet as he gathered the papers, he felt the faintest stir of air, though no window was open. The flame of his lantern bent unnaturally, and a low murmur, many voices layered together, rose around him. He could not distinguish words, but he knew their intent. They would not allow his escape. In desperation, he confided to Miss Hanrahan. She urged him to leave at once, to take his sister and her children and go east before the snows deepened. But when he returned to his home to collect them, he found the youngest girl already awake, seated at the table. She was drawing, though no pencil had been given to her. Her small hand moved as if guided by another. When he tore the page from her, his heart froze. It was him, lantern in hand, standing alone before the oak. The watchers gathered close. The girl looked up, her eyes wide but calm. "They said it has to be you." His hands shook, crushing the page. It was no longer confined to the orphanage. The reach had spread to his own family, his own blood. Dr. Wren staggered back from the table, staring at his niece's quiet face. Her hand still twitched, as if yearning to draw even without the page. He tore the pencil from her grasp, but she did not resist. She only whispered, "It is already written." The words, spoken in that small voice, hollowed him out. He could no longer keep still. He returned to the orphanage in fury, storming into the study hall where the children sat in their neat rows, their heads lifted in unison, eyes clear and unblinking. "What have you done?" he demanded. "What power drives you?" No answer came. Only Samuel rose, calm as ever. "We do nothing, Doctor. We are the page. You are the ink." Wren's composure broke. He seized Samuel by the shoulders, shaking him. "What does that mean? Who commands you?" But the boy did not flinch, did not even blink. Instead, he lifted his hand and pointed beyond Wren, toward the windows that framed the dark ridge. At that moment, the floor beneath them groaned violently, sending a shudder through the hall. Miss Hanrahan cried out, clutching at a desk for balance. The children swayed but did not fall. Their chant began again, low and united, rising from dozens of throats into a single rhythm that filled the room with oppressive weight. The doctor tried to pull Samuel away, but the boy's body grew rigid, heavy as stone. One by one, the other children rose, moving toward him. Not running, not lunging, but closing in with deliberate steps, their eyes fixed on him as though he were prey. Miss Hanrahan grabbed Wren's arm. "We must leave, now!" she cried. He felt her tug, her desperation, and for a moment his reason broke through. They fled down the corridor, the echo of small, measured footsteps following close behind. The orphanage itself seemed alive with sound. Doors rattled, floorboards groaned, the very walls creaked as if breathing. Wren's lantern swung wildly, casting fractured light across pale faces that appeared at every turn, children standing motionless in doorways, their gazes unbroken. At last they burst into the cold night, snow biting their lungs. The ridge loomed dark against the sky, and from it came a sound, a low, resonant hum, as though the earth itself had awakened. Behind them, the children poured from the orphanage in perfect formation, silent now, forming rows upon the snow. Miss Hanrahan clutched his arm, her face drained of all color. "They mean to take us," she whispered. Wren's heart pounded. He raised his lantern high, its trembling flame casting a fragile circle of light. The children did not advance. They only watched, rows deep, their faces pale moons in the dark. Then Samuel stepped forward, snow crunching softly beneath his feet. He raised a hand, pointing once more to the ridge. "It is waiting," he said. "It will not wait forever." Wren felt it then, the pull from beneath the ground, the inexorable gravity of something vast and patient. It did not want just the children, it wanted him. It wanted all who had seen. And as the lantern guttered in his hand, a whisper rose from the rows of children, spoken in perfect unison. "Witness." The word pierced Dr. Wren like a blade, reverberating through the frozen night. He staggered backward, lantern shaking in his grasp, the flame sputtering against the wind. Miss Hanrahan clung to him, her lips moving soundlessly, but no prayer could break the weight of that single word. It was not a command from the children. It was something older, wearing their voices as a mask. The orphanage loomed behind them, windows glowing faintly, as though light seeped from a body rather than lamps. The children did not advance, but their ranks did not scatter. They stood still, rows upon rows, their pale eyes fixed. Witness. The echo hung in the air, unshaken, long after their lips had closed. In the days that followed, Wren and Miss Hanrahan were moved under the pretense of rest. The magistrate ordered their removal from the orphanage, citing hysteria and exhaustion. They were placed in a remote sanatorium beyond town, its walls whitewashed, its corridors silent save for the rustle of attendants. Yet the doctor understood the truth. They had not been brought here for recovery, but for containment. His journals, his drawings, the evidence he had collected, confiscated. At night, he lay awake in his narrow bed, listening. The walls were thin, and from the chamber beside his, he could hear Miss Hanrahan's whispers. She spoke not to him, but to something unseen. Sometimes her tone was pleading, sometimes gentle, as if comforting a child. Other times her voice lowered into a murmur so alien it made his blood run cold. He tried to speak with her in the daylight, when her eyes were clear. "They still reach you, don't they?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded faintly. "They do not stop," she confessed. "When I close my eyes, I see them standing at my bed. I feel the soil beneath me shift. They ask me to lie down. They promise I won't be alone." Her words rattled him more than any vision. He realized then that their captivity was not protection, but an offering. They had been placed here, away from others, like kindling set aside for a fire. On the fourth night, he heard it himself, a low scratching at the wall by his bed, at first faint like the scuttle of mice, then deliberate, purposeful. He struck a match, heart hammering, and held the flame close. There, etched freshly into the plaster, was the outline of the oak tree. Its roots spread downward, curling into trenches, reaching not just beneath fields, but beneath the sanatorium itself. The next morning, he begged the attendants to let him leave, insisting he must warn the town, but they only exchanged uneasy glances. "Rest, doctor," they said softly. "You are unwell." His fury rose, but his voice faltered, for in their eyes he saw something worse than disbelief. He saw pity, the kind reserved for those already lost. That night, when the scratching came again, louder now, he pressed his ear to the wall. The sound was not only of carving, it was breathing, slow and steady, drawn from the earth itself. And then, through the plaster, he heard the whisper once more, close as his own breath. "Witness." Dr. Wren recoiled from the wall, the match burning low between his trembling fingers. The flame guttered and died, leaving him in darkness. Yet the whisper lingered, woven into the silence like a thread he could never cut free. He pressed both hands against his ears, but it made no difference. The word was not sound alone. It lived inside his bones. By morning, his pleas grew more frantic. He demanded the attendants let him write, begged for his confiscated journals, insisted that without his notes, he could not defend himself. They humored him with paper and ink, but the moment he sat to write, his hand betrayed him. Instead of sentences, his fingers traced trenches, faceless figures, the oak tree. His mind screamed for words of reason, but the hand obeyed another will. Miss Hanrahan, confined nearby, fared no better. She had ceased speaking to the staff altogether. When Wren managed to glimpse her, her eyes carried a strange light, soft and feverish, as though she were listening always to voices just beyond reach. On one occasion, he caught her mouthing something in the stillness of night. The word was not witness. It was longer, older, its syllables foreign. The moment she realized he had seen, she pressed a finger to her lips, warning him to silence. It was then Wren discovered the journals hidden in her room. Not the ones he had written, but a small, leather-bound book she had smuggled, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. It was no diary, but a record of deaths within the orphanage, spanning decades, not merely from illness, but from accidents, falls, even drownings, all curiously frequent for a single institution. And between the entries drawn in margins, the same marks, trenches, watchers, names. The revelation chilled him deeper than the winter air. This was not a sudden affliction. The orphanage had been steeped in it for generations, the children repeating what countless before them had already begun. He realized with horror that he and Miss Hanrahan were not the first to be chosen, only the latest. That night, the scratching at the wall returned, louder, more insistent. He lit his lantern, but the plaster already bore fresh carvings. A trench stretched across the wall, reaching toward the ceiling, and within it lay figures more detailed than ever before. Their faces were not blank this time. They were his, Miss Hanrahan's, and beside them, the faces of attendants he had seen that very morning. His lantern shook, its glow catching on the last line of the drawing, a cluster of words scrawled beneath the trench. The letters were rough, uneven, but unmistakable. Soon inside, the sanatorium groaned with the weight of the storm outside, but Wren felt the sound was deeper, resonating through the foundations. Beneath the floor, he swore he heard movement, soil shifting, earth unsettled. The attendants dismissed his cries as delirium, but he knew what stirred. And on the seventh night, as snow blanketed the grounds, an attendant was found lifeless in her bed, her body twisted as though laid carefully into place. The children's drawings had shown her 2 days before, marked neatly among the trenches. When Wren was led past her still form, Miss Hanrahan leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. Her voice was calm, almost tender. "Do you see, doctor? Even here they do not stop." Her words lingered like smoke in the air, clinging to Dr. Wren's thoughts long after she had turned away. The sanatorium, meant to silence what had begun in Ashfield, now pulsed with the same undercurrent of dread. He no longer dreamed in fragments. His nights unfolded with clarity, visions of the oak, the trenches, the endless rows of watchers leaning ever closer. Each morning he awoke with soil beneath his nails, though he had not left his bed. The staff whispered about him in corridors, their pity sharpened by fear. More attendants began to fall ill, their sleep disturbed by scratching in the walls, their faces growing hollow. When another body was found, this time the head orderly, Wren knew the contagion had fully taken root. It was not madness that spread, but something older than the institution itself. Miss Hanrahan seemed to surrender more quickly. She no longer resisted the whispers. Her eyes softened with a serenity that unsettled him more than her panic ever had. "It is easier if you accept," she told him one evening, her voice carrying the calm of someone already halfway gone. "The watchers do not punish, they gather, they keep." Wren recoiled. "Keep what?" Her smile was faint, her lips pale. "Us, all of us. It has always been this way." The days blurred into one another. Outside, snow deepened across the grounds, erasing all tracks. Inside, the drawings multiplied. Sheets of paper appeared in the corridors, in the kitchens, even in Wren's locked quarters. He no longer knew if his own hand created them in the night, or if something else guided the ink. They were everywhere, trenches upon trenches, the watchers pressing close, his figure bent beneath the lantern's glow. And then, without warning, Miss Hanrahan was gone. Her bed found empty at dawn, her window unbroken, her door locked from within. Only a single page lay on the pillow, the oak tree, its roots spread wide, and beneath them a single word written in her hand: home. The sanatorium searched for days, but her absence was treated with resignation, not shock. "She has gone where the rest have gone," murmured one attendant before crossing himself. Wren did not argue. He only stared at the page, tracing the roots until his vision blurred. Weeks later, he too disappeared. His bed was found neatly made, his journals missing, the walls of his chamber scarred with deep carvings. Trenches stretched across every surface, climbing like vines, and among them, etched over and over, a single word: witness. The town of Ashfield never spoke of him again. The orphanage remained, its halls still echoing with children's voices. New caretakers came and went, but the drawings never ceased. Each generation, the papers filled again, trenches deepening, names inscribed. Some whispered that the sanatorium itself was swallowed, its foundations sinking slowly into the soil until only the snow remained above. And yet, even now, there are reports, small towns, scattered places, of children who draw not homes or families, but pits. Children who scrawl names they should not know. Children who point to the ground and say, "Here." The pattern spreads quietly, like frost across glass, inevitable and unseen until it covers all. So I leave you with this. If ever you find a child's drawing of graves, if ever you hear a whisper from beneath your floorboards calling you to watch, remember Dr. Wren's fate. For the watchers do not sleep, and they do not forget. They are waiting, and perhaps they are already looking at you.